based on the book, you were in Kenya in 2001, and this was actually the period when the UN declared that region, Sub-Saharan Africa, as the epicenter of the HIV epidemic. What I want to know is, can you share a little bit about how HIV looked like at that time? How did it manifest in the community? What did you see?
2001. Well, I guess the first time I encountered the African AIDS epidemic was in Uganda in 1993.
Ooh, even earlier than that.
Yeah, so that was really the first time I arrived, because I was not I was a biochemist before I got into public health, and I ended up getting kind of just disenchanted with lab work and decided that I wanted to work on something applied and important. And so I ended up working on an early AIDS vaccine project in Uganda. And that was the first time I had been aware of HIV in New York, of course, because I knew people here who had died of it. But it was nothing like the situation in Uganda, where just about every family seemed to be affected by it. And I was working at a hospital, so you saw people with HIV all the time at different stages of the disease. And it was quite, everyone was terrified, actually. People were really, really scared. And it was pretty heartbreaking, actually.
Right, totally. And talking about the scale of the disease, in comparison to what you saw in New York and what you saw in Uganda, what do you think are some of the things that magnified this disease in that part of the world versus here?
So what was the sort of epidemiological reason why it was worse?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Well, the theory that I didn't know at the time. I had no idea. And there was a theory that untreated sexually transmitted diseases were the problem, because they somehow created conduits for the virus to spread. But subsequent research suggested that was not the case. There were untreated sexually transmitted diseases. They are a bad thing, but they could not explain why HIV was spreading so rapidly. And as far as I know, and I still believe this, I mean, eventually it took a while, and many years later, I came across a theory that had been developed by a researcher in Washington State, who worked in Washington, University of Washington.
Right.
And her theory was that it had to do with patterns of sexual behavior. It's not that people in that region were having so many sexual partners, but they were more likely to have ongoing sexual relationships with more than one person, say 2 people, 3 people, something like that. Not everybody did, but enough people did to set up a kind of network, a sexual network, which I describe in the book, that can rope in large numbers of people who aren't necessarily promiscuous. They may even have only one partner.
Right.
And that theory seemed to explain a lot of anomalies about the epidemic, the fact that men have riskier behavior and yet more women are infected. If it was just a matter of multiple partners, then men would be more infected, as you see the pattern in the United States, right, for example, or in Europe or everywhere else in the world. So there were a bunch of other, and the fact that so many people who were not necessarily impoverished sex workers or particularly promiscuous were getting infected. I mean, so many of my colleagues at the lab and the hospital and so on, and I was also teaching at that time, and these people were basically middle class, ordinary people. So and middle-aged very often. So what was going on? That was really the puzzle. Nothing else made sense, and nothing else still makes sense, to be honest.
And
So,
what you're saying is something I can relate to as a journalist from Botswana. One of the when I think it was President Festus
Mohai.
Mogae, yes, when he was like carrying call, he was like, guys, my economy is going down.
Yeah.
Teachers, nurses, doctors are all affected. It's not just a certain population, it is the whole population that is being affected. So totally relatable about that abnormally compared to the Western world. So when you talk about that, you are bringing me to the gendered aspect of HIV, right? And specifically, I thought it's interesting in your chapter where you talk about the underground economy of AIDS, where you specifically look, and I quote you here, where you say, throughout history, poor young women have used their sexuality to cope with poverty, a trend that has almost certainly increased with economic globalization. Can you just share a little bit about why it continues to perpetually and unduly affect women versus men or any other population?
Well, you mean, well, HIV affects women more in these sexual networks just because of the way the sexual networks work. It's a kind of mathematical thing. You just have to visualize it. It has sort of, if you have a network of concurrent sexual partnerships, women are going to be more affected by it. That's just the rules of mathematics, which is somebody else's problem. But why are women in a disadvantaged situation when it comes to sex in Africa and everywhere? I think that's your question, isn't it? And why does globalization make it worse?
Yes.
Yeah, I think globalization made it worse, particularly for Africans, at least the Africans I wrote about.
Yes.
Because it increased inequality. And wherever you see increased financial inequality, you tend to see increased gender inequality, because women being everywhere less able to make money on their own,
Right.
begin to compete for the men with the most money. And that involves subverting their own in this case, taking risks with their health and their mental well-being and so on, that they might not take in a more egalitarian situation where there were sort of there weren't so many poor men around, that where more men had enough money to manage a household and contribute to one. But in a situation where you have extremes of wealth, you have a scramble, and that means women are always going to be at a disadvantage. So, and I think one saw that because, what was going on, it sounds like a contradiction, because here I am saying that the women that were most at risk were not necessarily commercial sex workers.
Right.
And yet they were competing for relatively middle to upper class men. In part, that's continuous with what actually goes on even in countries where we're all supposed to marry for romance, not for money, but goes on in a subtle way in every society, even though it's suppressed. We don't talk about it so much. But it's also the case that that I sense that there was also, because material wealth is a kind of relatively new thing in African culture, at least something that in many kind of smaller groups really is only a few generations old, the exposure to it anyway, is that it has a kind of symbolic value, that it and a meaning that's kind of deeper. It symbolizes something and means something that it doesn't mean for us. I mean, we've learned, for example, you're not supposed to mix sex and money in the West, because if a guy pays you for sex, that means he never wants to see you again. I found, the opposite is often true in Africa, that if a guy doesn't give you money, then he doesn't want to see you again. So money is a kind of symbol of affection, and it's a symbol of a deeper relationship. Whereas, for us, it's a symbol of a cold transaction. So it just added, it got very, very mixed up. And I'm not sure I even to this day really understand what it is.
The complexities and dynamics of that. And
yeah,
reminding me of the blesser and the blessee. They say in South Africa, where the older guy with more money, the younger woman who's literally with the guy for the money, because of those economic situations that propel the poverty generational that you talk about.